It was a warm Tuesday evening in late spring, the kind where the sun lingers just long enough to paint the sky in soft oranges and purples before finally giving way to night. The streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood were calm. Kids had long since gone inside, lawns were freshly cut, and most folks were settling in after dinner. But on Oak Ridge Boulevard, tension was about to flare in the most unexpected way. A black SUV rolled smoothly down the road, its driver relaxed behind the wheel. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't weaving. In fact, he'd just come from a long day at the Pentagon, hours of briefings, strategy talks, and planning for overseas operations. Now all he wanted was to get home, take off his shoes, and maybe enjoy a quiet cup of tea before bed. He wore a simple button-down shirt and slacks, no uniform. No medals, just a tired man in his 50s who'd given decades of his life to his country. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flashed behind him. He checked his mirror, sighed gently, and pulled over without hesitation. He knew the drill. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel. Years of discipline, honed in deserts, mountains, and war zones, kicked in automatically. He stayed calm, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car was young, maybe early 30s, with a stiff posture and a look that said he'd already made up his mind. He approached slowly, hand resting near his belt, eyes narrowed. When he reached the window, he didn't greet the driver. He just stared for a beat too long. "License and registration," he said flatly. The man in the SUV nodded, reached for his glove compartment with deliberate slowness so there'd be no sudden moves, and pulled out his registration. Then he reached for his wallet and handed over his driver's license along with a military ID. The officer glanced at the papers, then snorted. "General, huh?" he said, voice dripping with disbelief. "You expect me to believe that?" The driver didn't react. He'd heard this before, the skepticism, the doubt, the quiet assumption that a black man couldn't possibly hold such a high rank. But he'd learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything, so he kept his voice even. "Yes, sir. That's my official military ID. You can verify it through the Department of Defense if you'd like," the officer smirked. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." He flipped the ID between his fingers like it was a playing card. "You think flashing a fake badge gets you out of a ticket? You didn't signal your lane change back there. That's a violation." "I did signal," the driver replied calmly, "for over 3 seconds as required by law. There's dashcam footage if you'd like to review it." That seemed to irritate the officer more. His tone sharpened. "You're being uncooperative. Step out of the vehicle." The man hesitated, not out of defiance but out of caution. He knew how quickly things could escalate, especially when you looked like him. But he also knew his rights. "Am I being detained?" he asked. "Not yet," the officer snapped. "But keep this up and you will be." There was a pause. Crickets chirped in the distance. A neighbor's porch light flickered on across the street. The driver took a slow breath, then opened the door and stepped out. He stood tall, 6 feet, broad-shouldered, posture straight from years of military bearing, but kept his hands visible. The officer circled him like he was inspecting a suspect, not a citizen who'd done nothing wrong. "You always talk back to cops?" he asked, voice low now, almost taunting. "No, sir," came the reply. "I speak respectfully always." The officer laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried more mockery than humor. "Respectfully? You think calling me sir makes you look innocent? I've seen your type before. Fancy car, fake title, thinks the rules don't apply." The driver didn't flinch. Inside, though, something tightened. Not fear, disappointment. He'd served alongside men and women of every race, creed, and background. He'd led troops through firefights, negotiated with foreign generals, and stood in the Oval Office. And yet here in his own country, in a quiet neighborhood where he paid taxes and mowed his lawn like everyone else, he was still just your type to someone wearing a badge. He said nothing. Silence was often the strongest response. Frustrated by the lack of reaction, the officer scribbled something on a notepad and shoved a ticket into his chest. "Disrespectful conduct. Court date's on there. Don't miss it." The driver took the paper without a word, got back in his SUV, and waited until the patrol car pulled away before starting the engine again. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his jaw was set. This wasn't just about a ticket. It was about dignity, about being seen. Not as a stereotype, not as a threat, but as a human being who'd spent his life protecting the very ideals this officer was supposed to uphold. When he got home, he didn't rant. He didn't call friends to vent. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, spread out the ticket, and studied it like a battlefield map. He knew the system. He knew how it worked, and how it sometimes failed people who looked like him. But he also knew something else. In this country, even the smallest act of injustice could be challenged. And he had more than just words on his side. He had truth. He had service. And if it came to it, he had connections that reached the highest halls of power. But for now, he'd let the process play out. He'd show up in court. He'd present the facts. And if that wasn't enough, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. As he poured himself that long-awaited cup of tea, he stared out the window at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, the officer was probably laughing again, thinking he'd put a man in his place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that the man he'd mocked wasn't just any citizen. He was someone who'd faced far worse than a rude cop on a Tuesday night, and he never backed down. The courthouse was nothing fancy, just a low brick building with scuffed linoleum floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the kind of stale coffee smell that clung to every public office. People shuffled in and out, mostly for traffic violations, speeding, expired tags, running red lights. No one expected drama, least of all the officer who'd written the ticket. He walked in like he owned the place, uniform crisp, chin high, exchanging nods with the bailiff like they were old friends. He'd been here plenty of times before, usually to testify against someone who'd resisted or acted suspicious. To him, this was routine, just another Tuesday, another chance to remind folks who was in charge. The man he'd pulled over arrived alone, dressed in a dark suit but no tie. Simple, respectful, not trying to impress. He carried a thin folder and sat quietly in the back row, watching the proceedings with the same calm focus he'd shown on the roadside weeks earlier. He didn't glare, didn't mutter under his breath. He just waited. When his case was finally called, the courtroom was half empty. The judge, a tired-looking man in his 60s with reading glasses perched on his nose, glanced at the docket and sighed. "All right, next up. Traffic citation, failure to signal, and disrespectful conduct." He raised an eyebrow. That wasn't a standard charge. Sounded more like someone's personal opinion than actual law. The officer stepped forward confidently, hand resting on the witness stand like he'd done this 100 times. And maybe he had. He gave his badge number, his name, and launched into his version of events. He refused to cooperate, he said, voice smooth but edged with condescension. Kept arguing, acting like he was above the law. Claimed he was some kind of general, like I'm supposed to just take his word for it. The judge frowned slightly. "Did you verify his ID?" "I glanced at it," the officer said with a shrug. "Looked fake to me. You know how it is, people print anything these days." Then, without warning, he let out a laugh. Not a chuckle. A full mocking laugh like he was telling a joke at a bar. He even said he served overseas. Like I'm gonna believe some guy in a nice SUV is running the army. He turned slightly toward the gallery as if inviting others to join in the amusement. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff looked away, but the man in the suit didn't move. He just sat there, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Inside, though, memories flickered. Of sandstorms in Kandahar, of holding a wounded soldier's hand while medevac helicopters roared overhead, of standing at attention during funerals for friends who never made it home, and now in this small courtroom he was being laughed at for daring to exist with dignity. The judge cleared his throat. "The defendant may respond." The man stood. No rush, no anger in his voice, just quiet clarity. "Your Honor, I respectfully request to present evidence." He opened his folder and laid out 3 items on the clerk's table. A printed copy of his official Department of Defense credentials, a USB drive containing the dashcam footage from his vehicle, and 2 signed affidavits from off-duty law enforcement officers who'd witnessed the stop from a nearby gas station. "I was returning from a classified briefing at the Pentagon," he said evenly. "I signaled my lane change for over 4 seconds. I provided valid identification. I did not raise my voice, and I have never claimed to be above the law, only that I deserve to be treated fairly under it." The officer scoffed. "Those affidavits could be from anyone, and that ID? Easy to fake." The judge studied the documents, then looked up. The dashcam footage, can we view it here? The court has a monitor, the clerk said. We can plug it in. But before anyone could move, the man in the suit did something unexpected. He turned to the judge and said, Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to make a brief phone call. 5 minutes. It may help clarify the authenticity of my service record. The officer laughed again, louder this time. Oh, here we go. Can I call your general friend? Real convincing. The judge hesitated. Normally he'd say no. Court was court. But something about the man's composure, the lack of defensiveness, the quiet certainty gave him pause. And that laugh from the officer? It had crossed a line. It wasn't professional. It felt personal. 5 minutes, the judge said finally. Step outside. Make it quick. The man nodded, thanked the court, and walked out without a glance back. In the hallway, he didn't fumble with his phone. He dialed a number saved under a single letter. R. It rang twice before a crisp, calm voice answered. It's me, he said simply. A pause. Then, are you all right? I'm in municipal court. Got pulled over for signaling. Officers treating my rank like a punchline. Another pause, this one heavier. Where? He gave the location. I'll handle it, came the reply. Don't say another word in there until I call you back. The line went quiet. He slipped the phone into his pocket and leaned against the cool cinder block wall, eyes closed for just a moment. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He just wanted the truth to matter. Back in the courtroom, the officer was still smirking, joking with the bailiff about generals in civics. He had no idea that within minutes, his department's chief would receive an urgent call from the U.S. Attorney's Office, that the Army's Office of the Inspector General would flag his name for review, that the quiet man he'd mocked was connected to people who spoke directly to the Secretary of Defense. When the man returned to the courtroom, he didn't look triumphant. He just sat back down, folder closed, hands folded in his lap. The judge was about to speak when the courtroom door opened again, this time not with a citizen, but with 2 men in dark suits, earpieces barely visible. They didn't say a word, just nodded to the judge and took seats in the front row. The judge's eyes widened slightly. He'd seen federal observers before, but never in a traffic case. Then his clerk handed him a folded note. He read it slowly. His expression shifted, from boredom to confusion to something close to alarm. He looked up at the officer, then at the man in the suit. The laughter was gone now. The room felt heavier, like the air had changed. Officer, the judge said, voice suddenly formal, please remain available. This matter may require further review. The officer's smirk vanished. What, why? It's just a ticket. But the judge wasn't listening anymore. He was already whispering to the clerk who hurried out the side door, and in that moment, the officer finally understood. This wasn't just another Tuesday. This was the day his assumptions caught up with him, and the man he'd laughed at. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to fight, he just needed to make one phone call. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet, just the hum of overhead lights and the distant echo of footsteps from another floor. The man in the suit stood near a water fountain, arms loose at his sides, breathing slowly. He wasn't nervous. He'd been in far worse places, places where one wrong move meant life or death. This was just another kind of battlefield, one fought with paperwork, protocol, and patience. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered on the first ring. It's done, came the voice on the other end. Calm, firm, the kind of voice that had commanded rooms full of generals and diplomats. The Civil Rights Division is opening a preliminary review. They've contacted the local U.S. attorney. Your dash cam footage and service record have been forwarded to them directly. Also, your friend at the Pentagon just called the police chief. A small nod. No smile, just acknowledgement. Thank you. Don't thank me, the voice said gently. You earned every bit of that respect. Now go back in there and let the system do its job for once. He ended the call, slipped the phone away, and walked back into the courtroom like nothing had changed. But everything had. Inside, the mood had shifted like weather before a storm. The officer who'd been joking minutes earlier now sat stiffly on the bench, eyes darting between the judge, the 2 men in dark suits, and the quiet man who'd just returned. His hands, once relaxed, were now clenched around his duty belt. The judge cleared his throat. Given new information, he began, choosing his words carefully, This court is suspending further proceedings in this matter pending review by federal authorities. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Federal? Over a traffic ticket? The officer shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's not fair. I was just doing my job. The judge held up a hand. Sit down, officer. This isn't about fairness in the way you think. It's about whether your actions violated someone's civil rights, and whether your department has a pattern of similar conduct. The words landed like stones. The officer's face went pale. He'd heard that phrase before, in training videos, in hushed conversations after protests made national news. Pattern of conduct. That wasn't just about one stop. That was about his whole record being dug up, examined, judged. The man in the suit said nothing. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply stood, gathered his folder, and nodded to the judge. I appreciate the court's attention to this matter, Your Honor. As he walked out, the two federal observers followed at a respectful distance, not escorting him, just present. Their presence alone sent a message. This wasn't just about one man. It was about what that man represented. Decades of service, sacrifice, and the quiet expectation that, in his own country, he'd be treated like anyone else. Outside, the sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. A few reporters had gathered. Word had spread fast. Someone had tipped off a local news station. Cameras turned as he emerged, microphones thrust forward. Sir, can you confirm you're a U.S. Army general? Can you describe what happened during the traffic stop? Do you believe this was racially motivated? He stopped not because he wanted attention, but because he knew silence could be misread. He looked into the nearest camera, not with anger, but with the kind of steady gaze that came from leading people through chaos. I'm a soldier, he said simply. I've worn this nation's uniform for over 30 years. I've bled for it. I've buried friends for it. What happened to me last month wasn't about me. It's about whether every American, no matter their skin color, can drive down the street without being treated like a suspect. That's not politics. That's principle. Then he walked to his car, got in and drove away. No fanfare, no dramatic music. Just a man going home after a long day. Back inside the courthouse, the officer was being escorted to a side room by his own department's internal affairs unit. His radio had been taken, his badge clipped to a chain. He kept asking, "What's happening? Why is this such a big deal?" But no one answered. They just led him down the hall like he was already guilty. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., emails were flying. The Department of Justice had opened a file. The Army's Equal Opportunity Office flagged the incident for review. And in a quiet office near the Pentagon, a senior official picked up the phone and called the mayor of the city where it all happened. "We need to talk," she said, "because if this is how your officers treat decorated service members, I shudder to think how they treat everyone else." By evening, the story was everywhere, not because it was sensational, but because it felt so familiar. People shared it online with captions like, "This happens more than you think," or "He served so you could be free. Why wasn't he free too?" Veterans groups posted messages of support. Police reform advocates pointed to it as proof that bias training wasn't optional. It was essential. But the man at the center of it all? He was sitting on his porch sipping tea again, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. His phone buzzed nonstop, messages from old comrades, concerned friends, even strangers thanking him for speaking up. He answered a few, but mostly he stayed quiet. He hadn't wanted a spectacle. He hadn't wanted revenge. He just wanted to be seen. Not as a threat, not as a stereotype, but as a person who'd given his life to something bigger than himself. And in the end, that one phone call hadn't been about pulling rank. It had been about reminding a system, slow, flawed, but still capable of change, that justice shouldn't depend on who you are, but on what's right. As night fell, he thought about the young officer, not with hatred but with sadness, because that officer didn't see a general. He didn't see a patriot. He saw only what his own fears and assumptions allowed him to see, and that more than anything was the real tragedy. But maybe, just maybe, this moment could help someone else see clearer next time. The story didn't die down. If anything, it grew louder, not with shouting but with questions. People started asking, how often does this happen? What if he hadn't been a general? Would anyone have believed him then? Those questions spread through community meetings, news segments, and kitchen table conversations across the country. And slowly, the system, usually slow to move, began to stir. Within a week, the police department issued a short statement. The officer had been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. It sounded routine, but those who knew the department recognized it as unusual. Officers didn't get pulled off the street for disrespectful conduct tickets unless something deeper was going on. Then came the leaks. Not from official sources, but from within. A retired sergeant, tired of the culture he'd once been part of, quietly shared old records with a local journalist. They showed a pattern. Over the past 3 years, this same officer had pulled over black drivers at nearly 5 times the rate of white drivers in the same neighborhood, despite census data showing the area was over 70% white. Most stops ended with warnings or minor citations, but the language in the reports was telling. Appeared nervous, avoided eye contact, dressed too nicely for the area. That last phrase made people pause. Dressed too nicely. As if success was suspicious. The dashcam footage from the general's stop was finally released, not by the department but by the U.S. Attorney's Office as part of their civil rights inquiry. In the video, the general was calm, polite, hands visible. The officer's tone, however, was sharp, dismissive, even mocking. And that laugh, caught clearly on audio, sent a chill through viewers. It wasn't just unprofessional. It felt cruel. Public reaction was swift. Protests didn't turn violent. There were no smashed windows or burning cars, but there were vigils. Quiet gatherings outside the courthouse, people holding candles and signs that read, "Respect is not a privilege, it's a right, and service should be honored, not questioned." Veterans organizations spoke out. A coalition of retired generals, black, white, Latino, Asian, released a joint statement. When one of our own is treated with contempt for simply existing while black, it dishonors the uniform we all wore. Even active duty troops, usually silent on political matters, began sharing stories of their own, being followed in stores, stopped for fitting a description, asked if they really belonged on military bases. The general himself stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He gave one more interview, just one, and in it he didn't focus on himself. "This isn't about me getting justice," he said, sitting in a simple chair in his living room, sunlight streaming through the window. "It's about making sure the next young man, maybe a college student, maybe a delivery driver, doesn't have to prove his humanity just to drive home." But behind the scenes, he was working. Not for revenge, but for repair. He met with city leaders not as a victim, but as a partner. He suggested practical steps. Mandatory bias training co-developed with community leaders, body cameras with automatic activation during stops, a civilian oversight board with real power. He didn't demand punishment, he asked for prevention, and the system, for once, listened. The police chief, a man who'd served 20 years on the force, publicly apologized. Not a vague "mistakes were made" statement, but a direct one. "We failed. We failed this man, we failed our community, and we failed the oath we took to protect and serve everyone equally." He announced a full review of all traffic stops from the past 2 years, with outside auditors brought in to check for racial disparities. Then came the hardest part: accountability. After 6 weeks of investigation, the officer was fired. Not just suspended, terminated. The reasons were clear: violation of department policy on respectful conduct, misuse of authority, and evidence of discriminatory behavior. His union fought it, of course. They claimed he was being made a scapegoat, but the dashcam footage, the affidavits, and his own past records told a different story. He didn't go quietly. He gave an interview to a fringe news site, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that the general had played the race card. But few listened. Even some of his former colleagues distanced themselves. One longtime partner told a reporter off the record, "I've seen him do it before. I didn't say anything then. I wish I had." Meanwhile, the general received an unexpected honor. The Secretary of the Army invited him to speak at a national law enforcement training summit. Not to scold, but to teach. "You've walked both worlds," the Secretary told him. "You understand duty from both sides of the badge. Help us build a bridge." So he did. He stood before hundreds of police recruits and veteran officers alike and spoke not as a general, but as a citizen. He talked about fear, how it clouds judgment, about pride, how it blocks learning, and about service, how it's not about rank or uniform, but about showing up for others even when it's hard. After his talk, a young recruit, a black woman barely 20, approached him with tears in her eyes. "I've been scared to wear my uniform off duty," she admitted. "Afraid someone will see me and think I stole it." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then wear it proudly," he said. "And when someone doubts you, let your actions speak louder than their doubts." Back home, life began to settle. The news cameras left. The hashtags faded. But something had shifted, not just in policy, but in people. Local high school students started a Know Your Rights workshop, inviting both police officers and community members to talk openly. A group of retired soldiers volunteered to ride along with new officers, not to monitor but to mentor. And the city council approved funding for a new program pairing mental health professionals with police on nonviolent calls. The general watched it all unfold from his porch, same as before, but now when he drove through town, neighbors waved, not because he was famous, but because he was one of them. A man who'd stood up not with fists, but with facts, not with rage, but with resolve. He knew the work wasn't done. Bias didn't vanish overnight. Systems didn't fix themselves in a month. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to hope. Because real change didn't always come with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it started with one stop, one laugh, one phone call, and one man who refused to be erased. 5 years later, the story wasn't in the news anymore. No headlines, no viral clips, no late-night talk show mentions. But if you walked into a police training academy in that state, or several others across the country, you'd see it quietly alive in the curriculum. Tucked between lessons on de-escalation and use of force policy was a short case study titled simply, "The Oak Ridge Stop." It didn't name names. It didn't dramatize. It just laid out the facts: a decorated service member, a routine traffic stop, a moment of disrespect, and what happened when truth met accountability. The man at the center of it all had long since retired from the Army. His uniform hung in a shadow box in his study, medals gleaming under soft light. Not for show, but as quiet reminders of promises kept. He spent his days tending a small garden, mentoring young cadets through video calls and occasionally speaking at schools or community centers. He never called himself a hero. He just said he'd done what any decent person would do, stood his ground without losing his humanity, but his impact rippled far beyond his quiet life. The federal review that began with his phone call had grown into something bigger. The Department of Justice and the Department of Defense launched a joint initiative called Operation Equal Ground, aimed at improving interactions between law, enforcement, and active duty military personnel, especially those of color. It wasn't about giving soldiers special treatment. It was about ensuring they weren't treated worse because of how they looked. One of the program's first actions? A nationwide database that allowed officers to instantly verify military IDs through a secure, encrypted portal. No more guessing, no more mocking. Another? Mandatory scenario-based training where recruits role-played stops involving people in positions of authority, doctors, teachers, veterans, learning to check their assumptions before their hands went to their belts. Perhaps the most lasting change came from the man himself. He'd worked with educators and psychologists to help design a training module now used in over 30 states. It wasn't about shaming officers. It was about building empathy. One exercise asked recruits to write a letter from the perspective of someone they'd stopped, imagining their fears, their pride, their family waiting at home. Another showed real footage, not just of his stop, but of dozens of others, followed by guided discussions on tone, body language, and unconscious bias. New officers who went through the program often said the same thing. It changed how I see my job. I'm not just enforcing laws. I'm protecting people even when they don't look like me. As for the officer who'd laughed that day, he never returned to law enforcement. After his dismissal, he disappeared from public view. Rumor had it he moved out of state, took a job in private security. There were no interviews, no apologies, no redemption arc, and that was okay. Not every story needed a neat ending. Some just needed a lesson learned, even if only by others. Back in the community where it all began, things felt different. The neighborhood watch now included retired service members and local clergy. The police department held monthly coffee with cops events, not in a station, but at the public library where kids could meet officers without sirens or suspicion. And every spring on the anniversary of that traffic stop, a small group gathered at the courthouse steps not to protest, but to reflect. They called it Dignity Day, a quiet reminder that respect costs nothing but means everything. The man rarely attended. He didn't need to. He saw the change in smaller ways. The young black teenager who waved at a patrol car and got a wave back. The veteran who wore his cap to the grocery store without being followed. The officer who, during a routine stop, said, "Sir, thank you for your service," before even checking the license. Those moments didn't make the news. But they mattered. On the evening of his official retirement ceremony from public life, no grand stage, just a backyard gathering with close friends and fellow veterans, he stood under string lights, holding a cup of tea, watching fireflies blink in the warm air. Someone asked him if he regretted how it all unfolded. He thought for a long moment. "I wish it hadn't taken a general's rank to get people to listen," he said finally. "But if my story helped someone else be heard sooner, then it was worth it." He never sought fame, never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to drive home without being made to feel like an intruder in his own country. And in the end, that simple wish had sparked something far greater than he'd imagined. Years later, a high school student working on a history project tracked him down. She asked what advice he'd give to young people facing injustice. "Don't lose your voice," he told her, "but don't lose your kindness either. Anger might light the fire, but compassion builds the house." She wrote that down carefully. And somewhere, in a classroom or a training room or a quiet conversation between strangers, those words kept going, passed on, not as a slogan, but as a way forward. The system wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was better. And sometimes, that was enough. As the sun set that evening, he looked out over his garden, rows of tomatoes, peppers, and sunflowers standing tall. He smiled, not because he'd won, but because he'd helped plant something that would keep growing long after he was gone. And in the end, that was the truest kind of service.